A prison yard at dawn, damp stone, a wall waiting for bullets. In October 1945, as France tried to call itself free again, the men brought out to die were not German occupiers. They were French. They had spoken French, worn French uniforms, signed French orders, and helped Nazi rule survive on French soil. Liberation had come with bells and flags, but it also came with a harder question. Once the enemy was gone, what should France do with its own traitors? Before this story unfolds, subscribe and tell me where you're watching from, because some truths from history stay hidden until someone speaks them out loud. The answer to that question had been forming for 5 long years. It started in the spring of 1940, when the German army crashed through France with a speed that stunned Europe. In June, Paris fell. The French government broke apart. Millions fled south in panic. Roads filled with carts, cars, soldiers, children, and people carrying whatever they could hold. It felt less like defeat than collapse. For many French citizens, the shock was almost too large to grasp. A country that had seen itself as cultured, strong, and central to Europe was suddenly occupied, divided, and humiliated. Out of that humiliation came fear. Out of fear came surrender. Out of surrender came something darker, because once German power settled in, France was no longer only dealing with a foreign occupier. It was dealing with French hands helping that occupier rule. Marshal Philippe Pétain, the old hero of Verdun, became the head of the new regime based in Vichy after the armistice of June 22, 1940. To many people at first, he looked like safety in human form. He was old, famous, calm, and wrapped in the language of order. His government promised discipline, stability, and moral recovery after what it called the failures of the old republic. Plenty of French people wanted to believe that. They were tired, frightened, and desperate for structure. Yet behind the language of national renewal, the Vichy regime moved into collaboration with Nazi Germany. It was not only pressured from outside. On many fronts, it cooperated willingly. It passed anti-Semitic laws in October 1940 without being forced to by Berlin. It removed Jews from public life. It helped police the country. It hunted enemies of the regime. It taught obedience as a civic duty. Under occupation, power did not always arrive with a German accent. Sometimes it came through French offices, French files, French uniforms, and French signatures. That was the wound that never stopped bleeding. The occupation did not survive on German force alone. It fed on local knowledge and local compliance. A prefect approved an order. A clerk stamped a paper. A journalist printed propaganda. A railway worker saw deportation trains leave. A police officer knocked on a door before dawn. Each act could look small when seen alone. Together, they built a machine. Some people cooperated because they wanted to survive. Some kept their heads down, said little, and adjusted to whatever came. Others saw profit in the new arrangement. Contracts changed hands. Careers opened. Influence became easier to grab when fear had emptied the room. Then there were the ones who went further. These were not people simply trapped by events. These were men who believed Germany's victory could help create a harsher France, more authoritarian, more nationalist, more violent toward enemies they already hated. They did not drift into betrayal. They walked toward it. Pierre Laval was one of the clearest examples. He had already been a major political figure before the war. Under Vichy, he became one of the central architects of collaboration. Laval was smooth, calculating, and deeply practical in the most dangerous way. He gave collaboration an official face. He spoke the language of necessity, statecraft, and realism. He made policies sound like unavoidable facts. Yet those policies tied French power more closely to Nazi demands.
Under Laval, collaboration did not look like chaos. It looked administrative. It looked legal. It looked as if betrayal could be filed, stamped, and sent forward in neat folders. The danger in that kind of power was enormous, because a gun terrifies the people who see it. while a signed order can reach people far away who never even see the hand behind it. Then there was Joseph Darnand. His path showed how quickly the line could harden from cooperation into open brutality. Darnand had once been seen as a patriot and a decorated veteran. By the occupation years, he became one of the fiercest French collaborators. In January 1943, he became the leader of the Milice, the Vichy paramilitary force created to crush internal enemies. The Milice hunted resistance members, tracked down opponents, helped the Germans, and spread fear across the country. Arrests, torture, executions, and intimidation followed wherever it grew stronger. With men like Darnand, collaboration stopped pretending to be only political. It became armed, organized, and proud of its violence. Still, this rise did not happen in one clean jump. It deepened, step by step, while France itself was changing under pressure. In the early occupation years, Germany seemed powerful and permanent. Britain stood alone for a time. The Soviet Union had not yet been invaded. The United States had not entered the war. In that climate, collaboration could look to its supporters like a path into the future. Newspapers praised order. Officials spoke of discipline and rebirth. Vichy tried to present itself as the France of tomorrow, while resistance seemed scattered, risky, and small. For ambitious men, the rewards were real. Offices were filled. Uniforms carried weight. Escorts opened doors. A regime born in defeat offered power to those willing to serve it. Some told themselves they were saving France from chaos, communism, or civil war. Some believed every word. Others simply liked what submission had brought them. Beneath this rise, the cracks were already spreading. Vichy claimed it was defending the nation, yet it depended on German tolerance. It said it stood for sovereignty, yet it ruled only because the occupier allowed it room to breathe. It spoke of honor while helping enforce persecution. In July 1942, during the Veldiv roundup in Paris, French police arrested thousands of Jews, including children, for deportation. That single event stripped away many excuses. This was no longer a story of a government merely balancing pressure from Berlin. French authorities were active participants in a system of persecution. The same pattern appeared elsewhere. Resistance networks were infiltrated. Informers thrived. Fear spread through neighborhoods. The more collaboration claimed to be restoring order, the more moral ruin followed behind it. The contradiction was impossible to hide forever. Men who called themselves patriots were serving foreign domination. Men who spoke of protecting France were helping break French lives. Men who called resistance dangerous were deepening the terror that resistance had risen against. Once those contradictions entered the bloodstream of the regime, the future began to change, even before many collaborators could admit it. By late 1942 and into 1943, the war no longer looked the same. Germany had failed to defeat Britain. The invasion of the Soviet Union had become a long, brutal disaster. After the Allied landings in North Africa in November 1942, Germany occupied the so-called Free Zone in southern France as well. That move destroyed another illusion. Vichy had claimed it still possessed a form of autonomy. Now even that fragile cover thinned out. Occupation tightened. Demands increased. The Service du Travail Obligatoire, the forced labor program, sent French workers to Germany. Anger deepened. Resistance gained new recruits. Collaboration answered with more repression. Violence sharpened because fear was rising on every side.
The milice grew stronger in 1943 for this reason. It was created when the regime sensed that passive obedience was no longer enough. Darnand's men became a weapon against fellow French citizens. They pursued Maquis fighters in the countryside, tracked suspects in cities, and helped the Germans hunt people down. The uglier the war became, the more openly some collaborators revealed what they had become. They were no longer pretending to stand above conflict. They had chosen a side in it. At the same time, their power was becoming more brittle. Germany still held France, but the shape of the war was turning. Allied bombing hit harder. News from the Eastern Front was worse. The occupation state responded with more control, more punishment, more propaganda. That usually means a system feels itself weakening. The louder it speaks, the less secure it is. The same men who had looked untouchable in 1941 and 1942 were now tying themselves to a future that was beginning to crack under them. They could not step back easily. They had gone too far, signed too much, ordered too many. The machine they helped build was now carrying them with it. By 1944, the surface still showed authority, offices still functioned, orders still circulated, guns still enforced silence. Yet underneath, the whole structure was trembling. Resistance actions intensified, German losses mounted. The collaborators became harsher because they sensed the time closing in. That is one of the darkest truths in this story. Their collapse did not begin the day France was liberated. It began the moment they bound themselves to a power that could never truly protect them. They rose because France was wounded, frightened, and broken. They kept rising because occupation rewarded useful men. But every reward rested on dependence, fear, and lies. Once the war started to turn, those same men stood exposed on the very ground they believed they controlled. The prison yard in October 1945 was still far away, but the path to it was already set. France had not forgotten. It had been watching, enduring, grieving, and waiting. Soon the waiting would end, and when it did, liberation would bring something more than victory. It would bring memory, rage, and judgment.
By June 1944, fear had changed direction. For years, people across France had been forced to watch, whisper, and wait. Then came June 6th, when Allied troops landed in Normandy, and the war that had felt fixed suddenly began to move. News traveled through rumor, radio, resistance channels, and the tense faces of men who had once acted certain of victory. German control did not vanish at once, yet something vital had broken. For collaborators, the ground beneath them started to shift. For the people who had lived under them, that shift felt like air returning after years underground. Hope came back, but it did not come back gently. It came carrying memory. All across France, that memory had names, addresses, uniforms, and faces. It remembered who had informed, who had profited, who had helped make arrests, who had joined the milice, who had preached obedience while others were hunted. Once the war turned, those memories stopped sitting in silence. They moved into the streets. That was when the reckoning began, and once it began, it was hard to control. In town after town, men suspected of collaboration were seized before any court could reach them. Some were taken from houses by resistance groups or angry neighbors. Some were beaten, some were shot, and some disappeared into the confusion of a country trying to free itself while still full of armed enemies and unfinished grudges. The emotional collapse was immediate because the occupation had never been only military. It had been personal. A deportation order could start at a desk down the street. A prison cell could fill because someone nearby had pointed a finger. When liberation came closer, many people did not ask for paperwork first. They wanted punishment. That is what made this period so dark. Justice and revenge arrived together, often in the same place, sometimes in the same hour. In August 1944, Paris rose and was liberated. Church bells rang, crowds filled the streets, and photographs captured joy that looked almost too large for the city itself. Yet even inside that joy, another scene was forming. Suspected collaborators were being rounded up. Women accused of intimate relationships with German soldiers were dragged into public squares, their heads shaved before cheering crowds. Those images became famous because they were so visible. But they also hid part of the truth. Public humiliation was easier to stage than careful justice. It gave people a target they could see. It gave liberation a body to punish. But behind those scenes stood a deeper problem. France was trying to cleanse itself while still carrying all the confusion, rage, and compromise of the occupation years. The purge that followed became known as the épuration sauvage, the wild purge, and the word wild fits because it was violent, uneven, and often immediate. Some of the people killed had clearly helped the enemy. Others were caught in local hatred, political settling of scores, or accusations that could not be cleanly tested in the moment. In some places, resistance groups acted with discipline. In others, anger ran ahead of proof. A country that had spent years under distorted law now faced the danger of replacing one distortion with another. Charles de Gaulle understood that better than most. He wanted France restored as a state, not only as a battlefield won back from Germany. That meant taking judgment out of the hands of crowds, local militias, and private vengeance, then placing it inside courts that could speak in the name of the nation. This was not only a legal move, it was political and moral. If France was going to claim dignity after occupation, then France had to show that punishment came from law rather than raw fury, even though fury had already spilled across the country. So the purge changed shape.
Files were opened. Commissions worked through names and accusations. Investigators tried to separate shades of conduct that the occupation had blurred almost beyond recognition. Some had enforced German rule. Some had written for it. Some had denounced neighbors. Some had enriched themselves through the regime. Some had followed orders inside a system they had never built but still helped sustain. Sorting all of that was slow, and slowness was its own kind of torment in a wounded country. Many people believed guilt was obvious. Others feared the reckoning would reach too far, or not far enough. The courts did not calm those tensions. They gave them a stage, a record, and a sentence. One of the clearest cases was Joseph Darnand. His story had already crossed the line long before the war ended. He had not simply adjusted to occupation or served Vichy in some distant office. He led the milice, the force that hunted resistance fighters, enforced terror, and worked closely with the Germans. He had even entered the Waffen-SS. By the time he faced justice, there was little room left for ambiguity. France was not judging a man whose guilt lived in whispers. It was judging someone who had turned French power against French lives with open zeal. His trial carried weight far beyond one individual. It told the country that some acts could be named without hesitation. Darnand was sentenced to death and executed by firing squad on October 10, 1945, at Fort de Châtillon. By then, his fall looked inevitable, yet it still carried a harsh symbolic force. A decorated veteran had ended before a firing squad because the path from patriot to traitor had been real, and France wanted that fact nailed into history. Pierre Laval's end was colder, and in some ways even more disturbing. Laval had helped give Collaboration its political brain. He was central to Vichy's direction and one of the clearest examples of how betrayal can wear the suit and language of government. He had spoken in the name of necessity, order, and realism, while helping bind France to Nazi interests. After the war, he was arrested, tried, and condemned. On October 15, 1945, just before his execution, he swallowed poison in a suicide attempt. It failed. Doctors revived him, and he was taken out to face the firing squad. That scene captured something brutal about the post-war purge. Laval wanted to escape judgment on his own terms. The French state refused. It would not let one of the main architects of Collaboration choose his ending. That refusal carried its own message. France had been made to kneel during occupation. Now it was standing over one of the men who had helped force it down. Earlier that same year, on February 6, 1945, Robert Brasillach had already faced a firing squad. His case unsettled people in a different way, because he was a writer and journalist, not a militia chief. He had used articles, editorials, and propaganda to defend fascism, anti-Semitism, and Collaboration. His execution opened a wound inside the purge itself. How much damage can words do in a time of terror? In Brasillach's case, the answer given by the state was severe. His pen had helped prepare the moral ground for persecution, and de Gaulle rejected appeals for clemency. That decision still troubles historians and readers, partly because it forced France to say that talent could deepen guilt instead of softening it. Through these trials and executions, the legal purge tried to look disciplined, but the country beneath it remained raw. Courts could sentence famous men. They could not erase the killings that had already happened in woods, roadsides, barns, and prison yards before the legal system fully took hold. They could not erase the crowd scenes, the humiliations, or the uneven way punishment sometimes landed. They also could not hide another painful truth. Collaboration had gone wider than the top names now standing before judges. It had run through offices, police stations, newspapers, businesses, and ordinary decisions. That was the betrayal inside the betrayal. The enemy had worn German uniforms, but occupation had often moved through French institutions.
Once that became impossible to deny, France had to confront a deeper loss. The old story of a united nation crushed from outside no longer held together on its own. Too many people had resisted bravely for that story to vanish, yet too many had also served, adapted, denounced, or looked away for the story to stay pure. That was the real unraveling. Liberation did not only defeat Germany and France, it exposed what France had become under pressure. Public celebration kept going because people needed it. They needed music, flags, relief, and proof that the long night was ending. But behind the celebrations stood prison cells, indictments, affidavits, confessions, and the faces of men who had once believed they were shaping France's future. Now they were being told that they had poisoned it. The legal purge gave structure to that judgment, although it could never make the pain neat. Thousands were condemned in different ways. Some were imprisoned, some were stripped of civil rights, some were executed. Many cases remained contested, and some people escaped serious punishment entirely. That imbalance haunted the whole process. Visible collaborators often fell hardest. Quieter ones could disappear into post-war life, hidden behind paperwork or the simple exhaustion of a country trying to rebuild. So the purge brought justice, but it also left unease. By the time the firing squads had done their work, France had restored something important. The state had reasserted the right to judge those who had served the occupier. Yet the emotional damage ran much deeper than any sentence could reach. People were not only staring at traitors, they were staring at neighbors, officials, writers, policemen, and countrymen who had helped make foreign rule possible. The cost of collaboration was now plain, and it was more than death. It was the collapse of trust inside the nation itself. France had been wounded by defeat in 1940. Now, in victory, it had to face the faces of those who had made that wound deeper, richer, and more enduring. The war was ending, but peace was still far away, because once a country discovers how much betrayal happened in its own language, the hardest judgment is still to come.
What came after the verdicts was a quieter struggle, and in some ways it cut deeper. France had punished some of the most visible collaborators, but punishment did not settle memory. Courtrooms could close, prison gates could lock, firing squads could carry out sentences. None of that made the occupation simple in hindsight. By late 1945, the country was trying to restore ordinary life while still walking through ruins, shortages, grief, and the moral wreckage left by 4 years of compromise and fear. Families were searching for the missing. Survivors were returning from camps. Records were being opened. In that growing pile of evidence, one truth kept widening. Collaboration had not been the work of a tiny, isolated group. It had reached into ministries, police offices, newspapers, businesses, rail lines, and homes. Around 76,000 Jews were deported from France during the war, and most were murdered. That fact sat behind every claim that Vichy had only tried to shield the country from something worse. It had not shielded them. It had helped the machinery run. Even Philippe Pétain, the old marshal once wrapped in the image of national rescue, stood trial in July and August 1945. He was condemned to death for treason, then had his sentence commuted to life imprisonment,
because of his age and his First World War status. That decision showed how tangled this ending really was. France could condemn the head of Vichy, yet even then, history, symbolism, and politics all pressed on the judgment. The country wanted justice, though it was still arguing with its own past while delivering it. That is where the final truth begins to harden. Many collaborators were punished, but a nation cannot place every form of weakness, obedience, greed, and fear in the dock. Some men were executed because their guilt was too public to survive. Others went to prison. Others were barred from public life through what the courts called national degradation, stripped of civic rights and public standing. Yet many people who had adapted, benefited, or looked away found paths back into ordinary life. France needed teachers, clerks, railway workers, police officers, mayors, and civil servants. It could not remove every person touched by the occupation without paralyzing itself. So the line between justice and necessity appeared again, only this time in reverse. During the occupation, necessity had been used to excuse collaboration. After liberation, necessity helped limit how far the reckoning could go. By the early 1950s, amnesty laws softened many penalties and allowed parts of the country to move on more quickly than the dead ever could. That is one reason the public memory of this period became so selective. The cleanest story was the story people needed most: a nation of resistors, wounded by Germany, rising again through courage. There was truth in that story, and there was also protection in it. It gave France pride. It gave families something honorable to hold. It gave the post-war republic a stronger mirror to look into. But it also pushed another memory into the shadows: the memory of neighbors denounced by neighbors, of French police making arrests, of officials serving a racist state in their own language, of revenge taking place before law could fully stand up, and of a country discovering that betrayal had worn familiar faces. That is why some images lasted while others faded. The shaved heads of women in town squares became one of the most remembered symbols of liberation because the scene was visible, immediate, and easy to photograph. It turned punishment into public theater. It also narrowed the story. Those women carried shame in plain sight, while the deeper structure of collaboration had often been built and maintained by men in offices, uniforms, and ministries. Spectacle drew the eye. Structure hid in files and institutions.
History can do the same thing if people let it. It can hold on to the crowd scene and lose the paperwork that made the crowd scene possible. The result is a comforting distortion, as if collaboration had mainly been emotional, personal, and local, rather than administrative, political, and national as well. That distortion still matters because it changes where blame seems to belong. If the story stays at the level of public humiliation, then the larger system escapes with too much dignity. What remains, once the noise dies down, is harder and more human than the legend of simple cleansing. France did not emerge from liberation morally washed. It emerged scarred, carrying both justice and imbalance, both courage and compromise. Some people had resisted at terrible cost. Some had survived by silence. Some had crossed into service of the occupier and followed that path until it led to prison walls and firing squads. Between those groups stood many others whose choices were smaller, weaker, less dramatic, and still part of the whole disaster. That is the part history often gets wrong when it wants heroes and villains arranged too neatly. A country does not fall into collaboration in one motion. It slips there through fear, ambition, routine, resentment, careerism, ideology, and the private hope that someone else will pay the price first. That is why this story reaches beyond France in 1945. It says something permanent about power and human limits. Most people do not imagine themselves serving cruelty when it first arrives. They imagine they are adapting, staying safe, obeying, staying employed, protecting family, getting through the week. Then the system grows darker,
and by the time its full shape is visible, many hands are already inside it. Some still pull away, some fight, some keep going. That is where a nation can lose more than territory. It can lose its sense of what words like duty, order, and loyalty are supposed to mean. France eventually rebuilt. Streets filled again. Governments changed. Children grew up in a country trying to turn the occupation into history instead of daily life. Yet under that rebuilding sat the older weight of what had happened between 1940 and 1944, and of what followed after liberation. The executions of collaborators were real. The trials were real. The grief, rage, and need for judgment were real. So were the shortcuts, the uneven punishments, the silences, and the later desire to simplify everything into a story people could bear. The bitter ending is that liberation solved the military occupation, but it could not solve the moral wound by itself. That wound had to be carried, argued over, hidden, reopened, and remembered across decades. In the end, the men who faced French firing squads after the war were only the sharpest edge of a much larger truth. The country was not merely punishing traitors. It was staring at the proof that a modern society can be broken from the inside long before it realizes how much of itself it has already surrendered. And the darkest part is this: when freedom finally returned, France still had to live among the echoes of the choices made when freedom was gone.